Welcome back. You're watching Checkpoint. On to the conversation of the day, and that is on the IEBC. Remember, with the BBI being the biggest political talk in town, that coming with it is calls for a referendum by July this year. Right at the center of this talk is the electoral body, IEBC, and how they will be conducting this possible referendum. Tonight, we take a look at the conversations around reforms, reconstitution of the IEBC, as well as the politics therein. Once again, to introduce my guest in studio, Felix Odhiambo, my immediate left, electoral executive director at the Electoral Law and Governance Institute for Africa. Felix, thank you. Always good to have you. Yes. As well as Lilian Mahiri Zaja, former vice chairperson, IEBC. Thank you very much as well for joining us. Remember, Lilian was in the Isaac Hassan-led team of the IEBC, of course. Thank you for joining us tonight. Remember, for you to join us in this conversation, you can as well text us on 22155 or tweet us any questions or add-ons to the conversation we'll be having here. The hashtag to use on our social media platforms is a checkpoint for us, of course, to have a holistic conversation. Let's begin with what has been big for the past 2 weeks, and that is calls for a referendum. Of course, owing to the BBI report that is already out. We saw Senator James Orengo the other day say that they would like to see this happen by July this year. From where you sit, Felix, is this viable?
I'm not sure about whether it's viable or possible to hold a referendum by June of this year. But what I would urge, to the extent that the Building Bridges initiative made substantial recommendations on reforming the electoral process, and the next election is barely 3 years from now, 2022, it should be clear to everybody in this country that given the problems and challenges that we've had in the previous elections, including the fundamental issues that were raised in 2017, and given the heightened politics in this country and the electioneering that began soon after the swearing in of the president, it is necessary for the country to prioritize finalization of the electoral reforms in the year 2020. And therefore, I support if the consensus in the country is to go the referendum way on the basis of the Building Bridges Initiative report, then that referendum ought to be finalized before November of this year. That way, it will give the country ample time then to implement the fundamental electoral reforms that will arise as a result of that process, and give the country an opportune time or an ample time to be able to prepare for 2022 elections. If we don't do that, if the country does not prioritize on electoral reforms before November of 2020, then I can predict without any fear of contradiction that we'll have serious challenges in 2021 and before August of 2022.
But I mean, having been a commissioner for the IEBC, we know this particular commission that is in office, Chebukati, as well as the other 3 commissioners who are in office. It's a challenge. There's been a myriad of challenges, from public trust, from the relationship with politicians. Given the numbers, they are well constituted, yes, but what lies ahead of them? Having been a commissioner, you're aware of the kind of work that is there. If we end up holding a referendum, what lies ahead for this commission?
There's a lot at stake. And I would largely agree with Felix when he says that the priority should be electoral reforms. Because if we go into the next year without any reforms in place, then we'll be doing ourselves a lot of injustice, looking at how we've had very divisive elections. And of course, a lot is expected of the Electoral Commission. Every time we hold elections, the trust is lost. When we are preparing for elections, there's so much demand, high expectations, high public expectations on the Electoral Commission. Yes, right now they are duly constituted. They could handle the referendum if it were to come. But what about the other issues that need to be done within the electoral process that must be done? An example is even the referendum law. We don't have that in place as yet. And we still have not had a proper national conversation on what reforms do we want to see. We are saying Chebukati must go and his team, But what are we saying? What do we want to do exactly? We need to sit down, see what we need to do, because every time we have elections, the first culprit is the electoral body. Why? Just because a party has lost and another one has won. That should not be the case.
So is this a classic case of putting the cart before the horse?
We are setting a precedent because of political expediency. And it will not work if we go ahead and do all these things without, first of all, having a conversation on what needs to be done. What is our priority? Even if we say we are doing electoral reforms, but what within the IEBC should be corrected? We are just talking about having to change the chairperson of the commission to be a CEO, but what about the other processes? You know, we need to look beyond what the politicians want for now. We need to look at the holistic picture and put in place a system that will serve the country well.
And I like that earlier you've mentioned the issue of public trust. You have been a victim of a commission that has been hounded out of office. But given that this particular body, electoral body in place, even the BBI report alluded to the fact that there was very low public trust on this commission, how then do we expect them to conduct a referendum by July this year?
That is quite interesting that we want them to conduct an election. And you heard what my senior and a whole political leader who is well respected, Senator Orengo, said, that we want them to do the referendum and then after that they go home. I mean, it was obvious he was putting political interest before national interests, really. IEBC is a political body. It has a political mandate, so to say, which is given by the Constitution. So if we are going to say that they are going to go home, what are we saying? And we are not reforming what we are seeing. We as a country do not even have a national ethic we can work around the elections or the electoral management body. We want to dismiss them because they have done things in accordance with the law, or we want to dismiss them because a certain political faction has won or a certain political faction has lost. So these are questions which need deeper scrutiny so that we can all, you know, benefit from a system that will work for everyone.
And Felix, this is not the first time we are seeing a call for the disbandment of an electoral body. It goes all the way back to the ECK, the Issa Hassan-led committee, and now this Chebukati-led committee. It seems to be a never-ending cycle after every election. I mean, are we having the right conversation as far as electoral reforms in this country are concerned? Are the politicians igniting the right conversations among the people and the right emotions?
I think the truth of the matter is that the discussion on electoral reforms in this country is more fundamental, and it should be appreciated. That is more fundamental than merely changing personnel at the Electoral Commission. Indeed, since the country reverted back to multi-party politics in 1992, this country has held 6 multi-party elections, within which time we have changed the outlook, composition, and personnel at the Electoral Commission 6 times, beginning with the Chesoni Commission, then Kipwitu, IPPG, IIEC, Ahmedizak Commission, and then now Chebukati Commission 6 times. And so it should be clear and apparent to everybody in this country that the call for reforms are far more fundamental than merely changing personnel. And so the discussion has been a bit misplaced. But again, it is not totally misplaced. If you look at the conduct of 2017, the problems that was in the Electoral Commission, and granted, and I think this people often forget, that Chebukati came into office in January of 2017. Election was held in August of that year. I'm telling you, there is nobody in this country who would have been able, given our polarized nature, the context of 2017, and state capture, to be able to conduct a credible election. But the truth of the matter is the perception, even with the 2013 Ahmedizak Commission and 2017 Chebukati Commission, the perception based on the conduct of the commission in those 2 elections, in terms of public support, was very low. But I think there is an opportunity for the country to appreciate that we have so many problems that we need to do. We have so many reforms in one, election management, and two, the conduct of those very elections that we need to put in place before the end of 2020.
Yeah.
The referendum, I don't think it's, I mean, it's not necessary to politicize this process, but we should, I think the country should be sufficiently warned that if this is not put in place, and given the toxic and polluted environment that we already have, then you can bet that 2022 would probably be worse than any other election that we've had.
Yet from what Senator James Orengo said the other day while they were addressing the press together with Senator Ongeri, that this particular IEBC, we can only allow them to conduct the referendum. Then after that, let them go away. Let us start from a clean slate for 2022. And this is even included in the particular BBI report.
Yeah.
So then, depending on how the referendum goes, if at all it happens, will it in any way be an indictment for this Wafula Chebukati Commission?
The one thing that has to be understood is that an electoral, the politics and the dynamics of a referendum are by far very different from the general election itself. That an electoral commission can conduct a fairly credible referendum like the ECK did in 2005, but then baggled the 2007 election. Or the 2010 referendum that was fairly held to be transparent, but then there were substantial challenges with the 2013 election. The difference arises out of the fact that a referendum is a very straightforward affair, where quite often we vote yes or no. But also the stakes are much lower in a referendum than in a general election and a presidential election, so to speak. So it is not sufficient to test the credibility of the capacity of the Electoral Commission on the basis of how they performed in a referendum.
Yeah.
But I think the question that we have to look at this thing holistically. Is the change of personnel what we need? As in, do we just need to remove these commissioners and replace them with others? We removed Kivuitu and his team, and then we had the Amerizak Commission. We removed the Amerizak Commission, and then we had the Chebukati Commission, and then now there's the talk of removing the Chebukati Commission. Yes. We are doing the same thing all over again,
and expecting a different result. Yeah.
So we really need to strengthen, and by saying that, by no means it should not be mistaken that I'm supporting some of the conduct, some of the things that we saw in 2017, the division within the commission, the fight between the commissioners, the rogue secretariat, and things like that. Far from it. But I think the point is that we need to think comprehensively and holistically on what do we need to do at the very minimum to be able to not only reform election management, but the electoral process generally.
Lilian, I would really like to draw from your experiences as an IEBC commissioner, because as Felix says, we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. As an insider, what is the biggest problem with our elections? And would we ever achieve independence at the electoral body as a country?
I think when we look at the challenges, for example, if I trace back from the Isaac Hassan team, you know, we were embracing technology. We thought it would be easier for the populace to accept technology, yet it was not accepted easily, even by the politicians, because you realize we did registration and the biometric voter registration. We went to managing elections, you know, the nomination process and results management system which we put in place, yet all these in the end were not, you know, to the satisfaction of the voters and the politicians, because we realized when we were transmitting the results, there were challenges, which when later on we came to do the post-election evaluation, these are the things we admitted. There were challenges, and only with the presidential election. Why? We put such a high stake on the presidential election, such that any slight delay, even in the transmission, is a big problem. So we need to look at those processes in isolation and see how technology can be used in a better way. But not to say that the staff, you know, the staff or the commission, they need to go home, because the law is clear. If a staff is culpable or a commissioner is culpable of misconduct, the law is there. There's a specific provision on how that is dealt with. So you can bring in reforms, yes, and probably the reforms that are being proposed now that, political parties will have the opportunity
and we are going to that shortly,
to nominate commissioners. But that is where we are coming from. We've come from that history with the Kivuitu Commission, which had such a blotted commission, and the commissioners couldn't draw the line between what they were doing as policymakers from the day-to-day administration of the commission. So you need to go one by one, look at each and every process and see how you can improve that. Otherwise, yes, we will be going over the same process. We are setting a trend. We will go, remove a commission, bring in a new person. The law is the same. We are not changing the law. The constitution is the same. The law is the same. And we are just bringing in new faces. Whether the faces are compatible with the political class or not, that will determine a lot on how they are perceived by the voters.
But there have also been numerous reports on elections. Every year, after every election cycle, like you say, we get post-evaluation reports and recommendations on how to do better on an election. We had one from the Kriegler report post-2007. There was a joint committee, Orengo Kivuitu committee, with more recommendations on elections. Is it shortage of ideas, or is it that we heavily politicize our elections in this country?
It is not,
it's
not a shortage of laws or shortage of ideas. It is just that the fact that we have not been able to internalize how the electoral process should work for us. Yes, it is a political process. We cannot divorce that from the EMB. It's a political process, so you have to deal with the politics of the day and ensure that while you conform to the constitutional principles and the law, you must also balance. There is that balance with the politics, which is very hard for an EMB which has no trust with the politicians and with the voters. Very difficult.
If you look at our constitution and the provisions that govern elections, I think they are probably, if you compare them with the other constitution and electoral laws of other countries, even here in Africa, I think ours is probably the most progressive. The Orengo Kiraitu bipartisan committee made far-reaching recommendations. So it is not just the law or the constitution alone, or the legal framework, or lack of ideas. But if you analyze the 2007, 2013, and 2017 elections, there are a number of factors that cumulatively affect our electoral process that makes elections so challenging and so vicious to an extent that violence and many other things, issues of credibility, are natural effect. One, it was state capture. If you look at the interest of the state in 2007, 2013, 2017, that was fundamental. Now, if you look at political parties themselves, look at the party nomination. As chaotic as they were, this also set and pollute the environment, but also election integrity in the electoral
I'll let
process.
you finish that once we get back from the break. Let's quickly take a short break here on Checkpoint. Once again, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Checkpoint. What do you think about calls for reforms within the IEBC? This is not the first time we're having a conversation around the electoral body. How can we do things differently? What are your thoughts? Any questions to my panelists? I'd be glad to share with them as we continue with the broadcast. Stay with us. This is Checkpoint.